Our topic for discussion today is democratic socialism. Socialism has many variants and it has never been a single stream of thought. But two of the most important variants have been Marxian socialism and democratic socialism. Obviously, Marxian socialism is not within the ambit of this discussion, and we'll have to concentrate only on democratic socialism. Before we go into the history and meaning of the ideas of democratic socialism, let us start with two definitions, one of democracy and the other of socialism, because I think that might help us in our later understanding of democratic socialism. Democracy is both an ideal and a mode of action, and each influences the other. It has brought change in the other with the long history of the term. As an ideal, etymologically it means the rule of the people. And starting from the days of Aristotle, it has never ceased to mean that, though on the way it has acquired a few new dimensions as well. For a modern definition of democracy, we may take help of the one given by Brian S. Roper in his book A History of Democracy, a Marxist Interpretation. Roper defines democracy thus, I quote, "I define democracy as denoting in a minimal but necessary sense a form of governance or self-governance that provides meaningful avenues through which the majority of citizens can exert a significant degree of influence over government decision-making and policy-making." That, in a way, sums up the entire characteristic of democracy. But citizens can't really influence the policy-making or the process of legislation only if certain conditions are met. First of all, they must have guaranteed liberty and equality, and also a guaranteed enjoyment of freedom of choice. So democracy that we'd be referring to will be an edifice of popular rule built on the three pillars of liberty, equality, and freedom of choice. The stability and strength of these three pillars would also depend on the foundation provided by legalism and consensus building. So a system which displays or upholds all these characteristics can surely be labeled as democratic. Socialism. Socialism, like democracy, is also an ideal and a system of economy and polity. Like democracy, the term socialism has also been evolving with time. Initially, socialism, as Andrew Haywood would like to point out, came from the Latin word sociare, which means to share, and it came as some kind of a reaction against the rabid individualism introduced by Enlightenment in Europe and further promoted by the laissez-faire economy of early capitalism. And the first use of the term socialism could be found in 1827 in an issue of the Cooperative magazine published from England. But by 1840s, the term socialism was commonly used throughout Europe to connote the doctrine that the ownership and control of means of production, that is capital, land, or property, should be held by the community as a whole and administered in the name interest of all. A question might arise that why there is such a change from the early definition of socialism to the later practice of defining it. Actually, the whole idea of socialism in Europe in the 19th century, early 19th century, came as a reaction to the newly established and rapidly spreading industrial capitalism. And industrial capitalism, that is constantly changing its mode of production, was bringing untold misery to the members of the working classes, uprooting them from their traditional occupations and also from their home and hearth. And all these rapid transformations in its wake brought about major social upheaval. And contemporary literature is abound with reflections of such social dislocation. And critics, they're basically humanitarian critics of this iniquitous system of capitalism, came to the writings of Robert Owen, an Englishman, Charles Fourier, a Frenchman, and also Saint-Simon, he is also a Frenchman. They all belong to roughly the same time period. There is almost from the middle or late 18th to middle of 19th century. Fourier and Owen both called for a rejection of industrialism and going back into the traditional agrarian community life. Saint-Simon, on the other hand, believed in the virtues of large-scale organizations and scientific planning, and in his book, The Industry, he proposed that turning the national state into a large production unit to be run under the control of a technocracy. In fact, John Stuart Mill and much later sociologist Emile Durkheim both considered Saint-Simon's ideas on socialism to be the fountainhead from which all later socialist ideas sprang. And these were the utopian socialists as identified by Engels later on, Friedrich Engels, lifetime companion of Karl Marx. They are called utopian mainly because the solutions they proposed to bring an end to the miseries introduced by the rampaging capitalism, the solutions were not exactly rooted in reality. And they're often, that's why they're called utopian. But on the foundation provided by the ideas of utopian socialists, basically Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, and Saint-Simon, we could find the later development of two major streams of socialist thought, as I have mentioned before, one of Marxian socialism and the other of democratic socialism. If we may start with the working definition of democratic socialism, democratic socialism is a political ideology that advocates political democracy alongside social ownership of the means of production, often with an emphasis on democratic management of enterprises within a socialist economic system. The term democratic socialism is sometimes used synonymously with socialism. The adjective democratic is often added to distinguish it from the Marxist-Leninist brand of socialism, which had been viewed as being somewhat non-democratic in practice. In a way, though some would like us to believe that democratic socialism came as an ideological challenge to the ideas of Marxian socialism, but I would suggest that the truth lies elsewhere. Democratic socialism, as we will find out in our discussion as it proceeds, never basically challenged the postulates of socialism. First of all, that all forms of property, in the Marxian term, all forms of means of production, should be owned in common. And that is the way to promote and preserve the basic equality in society. And they would also like to point out, the democratic socialists, and in conjunction with the ideas of Marxian socialism, that the whole control of controlling the production process and control over the means of production or the resources should be in the hands of the community, represented by a state to be run in the interest of the majority of the people, of the multitude. Now, on these points, there is no fundamental difference between the ideas of Marxian socialism and democratic socialism. But the basic point in which they differ, and they differ significantly, was that how to achieve this purpose, how to bring about all properties that aid in production process under common control, how to assure that politically. The major issue which differed Marxian socialists from democratic socialists was that Marxian socialists believed that only some kind of a violent revolution led by the working class can bring about that social transformation. And right on this point, the democratic socialists differed. In their ideas, there's no need for the violent social revolution to bring about that fundamental social transformation. They believed that the entire transformative process could be completed gradually, peacefully, using constitutional means and using the parliamentary path. If we may look back on the history since the 19th century, or it becomes very easily evident that Marxian socialism had been a more glamorous idea. It has attracted many more followers, and it has also attracted much criticism. And the major criticism was on the point of violent revolution and the dislocations it can and it did bring about in the society while going through the transformative process. Marx himself has also admitted the possibility that in certain developed Western countries, this social transformation can also take place peacefully without going through the violent revolutionary process. But in fact, socialism came not as Marx predicted in USA or England, but in one of the most backward countries of Europe of the time, Russia, and which was not having at that time, in the early 20th century, any worthwhile democratic institutions or democratic tradition or practices. And that is a major point of difference. But why? How could this difference take place? Why a new take on the idea of socialism could be found in the principles of democratic socialism? If we look at the mainland Europe or the continental Europe, beginning in the last quarter of the 19th century and stretching to very early 20th century, all through the continental Europe and even in the USA or in the distant Australia, socialist parties of various hues, various names, various structures, which claim to represent the interests of the newly formed and rapidly increasing working class, such parties are being formed. And the most important one, the most successful one, was the German Social Democratic Party, formed in 1875. It's the first socialist party in Europe, and is followed by the formation of such parties in France, Austria, Belgium, Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, and other European countries. And these parties initially, at least in Germany, would concentrate on Germany because that happens to be the most powerful social democratic party of that particular time. They were taking part in the electoral process and were getting success much beyond what they expected in the election process. And it was almost hoped for at that particular point of time that Marx's prediction that in some countries socialist transformation can come through a peaceful manner through electoral process might come true. But that didn't happen. Bismarck, the leader of the German nation, introduced certain legislative restrictions on Socialist Party, trying to cut down its wings. Though such laws did not last for long, but that did push the German socialists very much into the arms of violent revolutionary path. Actually, an interesting observation has been made by James Joel. He remarked, at the end of the 19th century, no socialist party could escape the difficulties presented by its own existence as a mass party, forced for the moment at least to function within a political system which at the same time it was seeking to destroy. There is something of a contradiction. The socialist parties were finding their strength, finding electoral recognition, winning seats in the parliamentary elections, being able to significantly influence government policy making in the interests of the working class, are ultimately trying to destroy the system that has nurtured it. So there is a contradiction. And due to all these reasons, we find an increasing radicalization of socialist movements in mainland Europe or continental Europe. But something else is happening across the English Channel in England. The cradle of democratic socialism has been England of the 19th century. And the whole idea started from there and also became popular from there, and later on spread to other parts of Europe and also to other parts of the world. And some factors you can identify which might have helped in the, let's say, a breakaway faction of socialism, a new kind of socialist ideas getting up on the air. The first was English insularity. Being in an island, England never did really connect to the mainland Europe, and they always had the ability of staying free and separate from the influences coming from the mainland Europe. Secondly, of all the European countries, England had the strongest set of democratic institutions, also a very established democratic tradition, which we can trace back to the glorious revolution of 1688, in which the royalist parliamentarian dispute was settled finally in favor of the parliamentarians. England remained a monarchical form of government, but as you all know, that its monarch, be it the king or the queen, steadily lost all the powers to the elected parliament. Coupled with this, there is a widespread respect for constitutionalism, particularly for rule of law. There is strong faith in gradualism. Gradualism meaning that ends can be achieved not in one go, not in one heavy blow, but slowly and sometimes imperceptibly. It might be a very good reason for the development of democratic socialism in England that of all the national bourgeoisie of that time in Europe, the English bourgeoisie was able to carry the democratic revolution to a successful conclusion, which ultimately strengthened democracy in England. But England was the home of industrial revolution, and England was the first to introduce machines to the production process, to start with in the textile industry and in the mining industry. And as a result of all the countries of Europe of 19th century, England had perhaps the largest working class population. So there is an urgent need to protect and preserve the interests of this new class of people who are rapidly increasing day by day. And also there is an equally strong desire to preserve democracy. And thus, the idea was taking shape, that both socialism and democracy are needed in equal manner. And out of this marriage of democracy with socialism, democratic socialism was born. If we go across the Atlantic, in the US also, a similar process was taking place, the development of democratic socialist ideas, but perhaps with less publicity than in England, but actually earlier than in England. In the contemporary times, during the campaign for the presidential election that's coming, we have heard the name of Bernie Sanders. He has dropped out of the race, but Bernie Sanders represents the tradition of democratic socialism introduced by Henry George in USA. And Henry George was the first to, of all the English-speaking people, including England, was first to write about the rampages of capitalism and to offer some solution way back in 1879. Let's come back to England. In England, ideas are taking shape about democratic socialism, but a real boost to the propagation of the idea and its ultimate crystallization was given by the foundation or establishment of Fabian Society in 1884 in London. Fabian Society, a society of like-minded, mainly middle-class, educated people who had their faith in evolutionary socialism rather than in revolutionary socialism. And its early members in Fabian Society, maybe the founding members almost, were George Bernard Shaw, Sidney Webb and his wife Beatrice Webb, Graham Wallas, Annie Besant, and Edward Pease. And the Fabian Society much influenced the later Labour Party formed in early 20th century, and it is always the intellectual support of the Labour Party they got from the ideas of the Fabian Society. This Fabian Society is what they want. Fabian Society was not into fighting elections, but they wanted that slowly and gradually, using the democratic institutions that were there in England, Fabians should educate people, make them aware of the problems of capitalism, and bring them to the path of socialism, so that ultimately, gradually, socialism can be achieved in England or elsewhere too, following this method. And that's how the ideas of democratic socialism came up in late 19th century England. Since then, it has spread to other countries. Since then, many political systems, not just in Europe, not just in England, but elsewhere too, and even in our country, India, we have been influenced by the ideas of democratic socialism, and it is still a force, and it to be a force so long as capitalism is there. Now, if we may take a summary look at the nature of democratic socialism and the methods it seeks to achieve or pursue in achieving its end. First of all, democratic socialism is not a complete departure or refutation of Marxian socialism. They both derive their strength, derive their intellectual ideas from the ideas of socialism. But democratic socialism is against private property, but not against all kinds of private property. It demands a reformulation of economic and political liberties, giving preference to the needs of the working class, needs of the poorer sections, and it advocates a process of selective nationalization of resources, nationalization of means of production, so that the economic inequalities can be reduced. And if you go into its methods, we'll find that it believes in evolution, not in revolution, and it believes not in armed struggle, but in a very gradual process of educating the people, finding their support, competing in elections, winning elections, and ultimately coming to control the parliamentary process, and then bringing socialist transformation through different legislations using the constitutional path. And as a part of it, economic planning takes a very large amount of the activity and the need to plan the whole economy. So that is basically democratic socialism. It is not something glamorous. It's not something which leads to debates. It hasn't led to bloodshed, or hasn't led to the charges of being anti-democratic. But slowly and imperceptibly, as it has thought socialism would come, it has also attained popularity